Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, a horror that knows no bounds. The UN estimates that about 542 people have been killed in North Darfur in just 10 days. I speak to the head of one of the global agencies trying to prop up essential services lost amidst Sudan's brutal two-year war. Also, a gallant son of the soil. Friends and colleagues of a murdered Kenyan opposition MP pay tribute to him. Charles Were was gunned down in his car in what's believed to be a targeted assassination. Also, Rwanda and DR Congo are set to submit drafts of a peace deal to Washington on Friday, but the fragile progress over the M23 Congolese conflict comes as trust also remains fragile between the neighbours, both accusing each other of backing militia groups that threaten their national security. Our correspondent in Rwanda takes a rare look around a militiamen rehabilitation site in the country. But first, the UN's rights chief has described the circumstances of Sudan's war as a horror that knows no bounds. At least 542 people have been killed in North Darfur over the last 10 days alone as RSF paramilitaries bombarded the El Fasher, the last city held by the army in the region. The RSF is trying to make up for losing Khartoum to the military last month, and on Thursday shelled the presidential palace in the capital. Overall, though, tens of thousands of people have been killed in a conflict that split the nation in two and created the world's largest humanitarian crisis. I'm joined now by the head of UNOPS. It's one of the UN agencies trying to keep things like healthcare, shelter available to the citizens and the civilians bearing the brunt of the fighting in Sudan. Now, he's just back from a trip through conflict zones in East Africa. George, thank you so much for making the time to speak to me. First of all, just give us a bit of a sense of what you learned and what you saw on the ground in Sudan.
Thank you for having me again, Georgia. Indeed, I came recently from the Horn of Africa, and particularly a visit to Sudan, Somalia, and Ethiopia. And in Sudan, indeed, as you just mentioned, we are facing one of the largest, if not the largest, humanitarian crisis in the world, with 13 million people in desperate need for humanitarian support, 13 million forcibly displaced, including 3.3 million refugees. And obviously, on the ground, what we could see is, in one hand, the people facing desperate need for support, but at the same time, their eagerness to go back home. I could see that, for instance, when visiting an internal displaced people camp, where obviously the population saw some hope in the fact that Khartoum has been released, so people want to go back home, but at the same time, they don't feel safe with the proliferation of mines, with the proliferation of explosives, with the lack of health, education, housing. So this is a really important moment where the international community must step in. Sudan cannot become a forgotten crisis. They need $4.2 billion of urgent support. You know how much has been provided? Just 7%. So this is the moment where the international community must step in and provide all the humanitarian support that is needed. We need the parties to engage on a genuine dialogue to ensure that that international humanitarian law is fully respected. But we also need to support the people on early recovery and reconstruction.
I think sometimes perhaps there is a risk that an understanding what and who that money is for is lost in the difficulty in seeing any progress in terms of peace talks between the combatants themselves. Now, one thing that really struck me when I was speaking to your team ahead of this was a description of some of the civilians with whom you've met as being people who suffer twice, not just because of the violence, but also just the exhaustion of trying to make their way through a world where all the infrastructure, everything that makes things work, has just crumbled around them. from your time in Sudan, has your understanding about just how impactful or traumatic that can be been deepened or changed? And also, has that fed into what you envisage as being necessary, as being priorities for UNOPS going forward?
Indeed, infrastructure matters. And I heard from the people, but also from, for instance, the Minister of Health, the impact of the war on the destruction of critical facilities, namely hospitals. So it was not just the houses that were targeted, not just the people that was targeted, also the critical infrastructure has been destroyed. So this is a key element. The people won't be able to go back home. They won't be able to have access to sustainable development if they don't have access to basic infrastructure, namely education and health. Let me give you one example. On education, I saw a school in Port Sudan with more than 800 girls going there every day. But that school is at the same time an internal displaced people center. So in total, they have 1,000 people between the kids that go to the school and those families that stay there. Do you know how many latrines they have for 1,000 people? 3. So this is the concrete elements that are important, which is the Sudanese are in desperate need for humanitarian support, but they also have the right to the future, which means that we need to support them with roads, schools, hospitals, energy, but also demining, removing all these mines. So it's really important that infrastructure is not being perceived as something that is a nice to have only when the war ends. It's something that is critical now. And the numbers, as I said, are quite eloquent. They need $4.2 billion and they only got 7%. So the international community cannot forget what is happening in Sudan.
Something that you mentioned earlier, you said the war in Sudan is a forgotten, it can't afford to be a forgotten conflict. Now, you weren't just in Sudan, you passed through Ethiopia and you passed through Somalia. Why do you think that they don't attract as much attention as perhaps conflicts elsewhere? And what's the practical cost of that?
And we could be talking also about Mozambique and Cabo Delgado or Mali or many other crises in Africa. The problem of this conflict that became portrayed crisis is related with our lack of understanding of the interdependence of this crisis, but also the fact that sometimes we are not seeing the consequences in our backyard. And this is, I know it might not be politically correct, but this is one of the things that I heard from people in Sudan. They were telling me, you know why we are somehow invisible to the international community? It's because the refugees goes not to the other continent, they stay in the neighborhood. So the fact that some of the forced displacement is staying in the region rather than going to other continents, namely Europe, is also a way to these kind of things remain a bit invisible. So we have a moral imperative.
George.
We have a moral imperative to support those people facing this conflict-affected countries. Prevention always, humanitarian as needed, and development wherever possible. This is the recipe.
Thank you so much. George Moreira da Silva there, the Executive Director of UNOPS. Well, police in Kenya say that the murder of an opposition lawmaker was likely a calculated assassination. Charles Were was fatally shot on Wednesday night as his car was stopped at a roundabout. Clarice Fortuné tells us more.
A tragic day in Kenya as the nation mourns the loss of Charles Ong'ondo Were. The opposition MP was gunned down on Wednesday night in what authorities are calling a targeted and premeditated attack. Police say he was inside his car when a man on a motorcycle approached and opened fire. Outside the morgue, mourners gathered, many in disbelief.
I would like to take this opportunity to condole with the family of Honorable Ong'ondo Were. We were with him today in Parliament, as she said, the whole afternoon, and he left, I think, barely 30 minutes before he met his death.
Security officials from multiple agencies have launched an investigation into the killing.
I have had the opportunity to engage with officers in government. The Inspector General of Police is here, the DCI is here, the Regional Police Commander is here. What we have a preliminary report of what transpired, but investigations are ongoing to establish what actually happened.
Described as the gallant son of the soil by opposition leader Raila Odinga, Charles Ong'ondo Were was serving his second term, representing the Kasipul constituency for the Orange Democratic Movement. The National Assembly said the killing had robbed the nation of a distinguished legislator.
Now, the US says that it's pushing Rwanda and DR Congo to sign that peace deal at the White House over the coming months. Now, Washington's expecting the neighbors to submit separate drafts this week as part of peace efforts that would also potentially deliver multi-billion-dollar investments to the region from US and Western companies. Rwandan-backed M23 rebels' seizure of key cities in eastern DR Congo this year has destabilized the country and beyond, triggering an international push to move peace negotiations forward. But trust remains fragile between Kigali and Kinshasa, and both accuse each other of backing militia groups that threaten their national security. Now, our Juliet Monti was given rare access to a Rwandan site for former FDLR fighters. She breaks down the history for us.
Tensions are running high within DR Congo and between DR Congo and Rwanda. Militia groups who've been operating in the region, some of them for decades, are at the roots of some of that strain. Now, I was able to visit the Mutobo Demobilization and Reintegration Center, a place where former militiamen spend months to be de-radicalized and get help to return to civilian life. By opening this facility to the press, Rwanda wants to showcase a militia group it says is very much still in play in DRC and claims some were recently captured there. The FDLR, the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, a UN-sanctioned group formed in the early 2000s by Hutu exiles, some of whom were involved in the genocide against the Tutsis. Now, why is that important? These rebels are considered an existential threat by Kigali, but authorities here want to show they can manage this threat by reintegrating ex-fighters. We spoke to several of them. Some were scared when they arrived here in Rwanda, a country they barely knew after years, sometimes decades in exile. But we must be clear here. We cannot confirm that they were free to speak openly.
J'ai trouvé beaucoup de traumas, beaucoup de guerres, mais
I've experienced trauma. I've seen a lot of war, but I'm capable of living with others here in Rwanda, and I'm capable of working in my country because I'm a strong man. I have a lot of strength, and I'm young.
J'ai beaucoup de force et je suis un jeune.
Here we train to behave like civilians. I myself was a captain, a commander, and an officer. And now the Mutobo authorities are preparing me to go back to my home, to Rwandan society over here.
Almost 13,000 former militiamen have passed through this center since 2001. Some surrendered voluntarily, others were captured and brought here. As I said, we can't be certain they are free to say whatever they want. The FDLR is one of the most sensitive issues between Rwanda and the DRC. While Kinshasa had once committed to dismantling the group, it now accuses Rwanda of using it as a pretext to justify backing the M23 rebels, whose offensive in eastern DRC has already claimed thousands of lives since January. Kigali claims Congolese forces are cooperating with the FDLR. Kinshasa denies that, but Rwanda's President Paul Kagame continues to insist that any peace deal can only start with the neutralization of the FDLR.
That breakdown there for us by our Juliette Montilly. That is all we have time for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us, and do so again if you can. Till then, take care.
This week, our reporters take you to southern Mexico, on the banks of the Suquiat River, the natural border with Guatemala.
El muro de Donald Trump no está en la frontera norte, el muro de Donald Trump está acá en el Suchiat.
Tens of thousands of migrants are stuck here due to U.S. anti-immigration policies.
Y tú estás solo, no tienes un abogado, no tienes quien te ayude. Bueno, anota mi número de teléfono. ¿Ya piensas quedarte? Ah, bueno.
Failing to reach the US, many find themselves choosing Mexico as their new home, like Lorenzo and Eusebio, who are trying to integrate.
Me dieron en la escuela un cuestionario sobre la salud de mi hija.
Me siento bien, me siento alegre y quiero tener más amigos.
The task now is to build their own Mexican dream. A new episode of Reporters on France 24 and France24.com.